All right, hello and welcome back, everyone. So this is part 7 of Intimations of a New Worldview, and this is called The Evolutionary Psychology of Meaning. And that is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the evolutionary psychology of meaning. So, John Vervaeke, this great and powerful man named John Vervaeke, did this 50-part YouTube series, which I've talked about before, and I'll put the link in the description, where he introduced a certain corner of the internet, a certain corner to the term meaning crisis. And in laying out his argument about the origins and consequences of this crisis, Vervaeke brings to bear the tools of cognitive science and philosophy and history, among other frameworks, and he does this brilliantly, in my humble opinion. John does not, however, discuss the meaning crisis, or meaning really, from the perspective of evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology. At least if he does, he doesn't go into it in any detail. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about meaning in life, the subjective sense of meaning in life, from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. I hear evolutionary psychology, so I am an evolutionary psychologist. That's what I am a PhD student for. And I hear evolutionary psychologists talk about this stuff quite a bit, and they are ignorant. And I say that lovingly. But they kind of, evolutionary psychologists tend to have the sort of Dawkins mindset. And for whatever reason, meaning seems very woo-woo to them, despite the fact that there is a huge empirical research literature on the causes and consequences of meaning in life, which as best I can tell, like no evolutionary psychologist has read any of that, except maybe my advisor has read a little bit of it, or my former advisor, because I've talked to him about it. But generally speaking, evolutionary psychologists, who I love, they get this stuff wrong. They have no clue what they're talking about. Generally, I haven't seen. Well, it's really strange actually that evolutionary psychology as a field has kind of been around for 30 years, and the empirical research on meaning in life has been around really for 25 or 30 years. It's been growing really for 25 or 30 years, and at this point, there is no real integration of them at all. No evolutionary psychologist has touched that research literature at all. Nobody's ever really even talked about it. Really interesting and strange to me that it hasn't been looked at. But evolutionary psychology has been very obsessed with mating research. Like that's what like a lot of evolutionary. So I think they've ignored some things that maybe they shouldn't have. But whatever. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at this literature on the causes and consequences of meaning in life from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. So I'm going to read something from Maps of Meaning. I think that Jordan Peterson is 100% correct about what he's going to say here, and we're going to come back to this at the end. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of where we're going to end up, but we're going to end up there in a different way than Jordan got there. We're going to look at different literatures, different theoretical frameworks than Jordan did, but we're going to end up in the same spot. So Jordan Peterson said in Maps of Meaning, and I quote, that the human purpose, if such a thing can be considered, is to pursue meaning, to extend the domain of light, of consciousness, despite limitation. A meaningful event exists on the boundary between order and chaos. The pursuit of meaning exposes the individual to the unknown in gradual fashion, allowing him to develop strength and adaptive ability in proportion to the seriousness of his pursuit. It is during contact with the unknown that human power grows, individually and then historically. Meaning is the subjective experience associated with that contact in sufficient proportion. Meaning is the most profound manifestation of instinct. Man is a creature attracted by the unknown, a creature adapted for its conquest. The subjective sense of meaning is the instinct governing rate of contact with the unknown. Too much exposure turns change to chaos. Too little promotes stagnation and degeneration. The appropriate balance produces a powerful individual, confident in the ability to withstand life, ever more able to deal with nature and society, ever closer to the heroic ideal. Each individual, constitutionally unique, finds meaning in different pursuits if he has the courage to maintain his difference. End quote. I think that he's 100% correct about that. But we're going to come back to that at the end because we're going to review a lot of empirical research that is going to support Jordan Peterson's thesis about meaning as the most profound manifestation of instinct. It is an instinct. David Pensoff is an evolutionary psychologist. He recently published an article on his Substack and I'll put the link to that article in the description, in which he declared that the meaning of life is bullshit. His Substack is called "Everything is Bullshit." It's really good. I have disagreements with David about multiple things, but his Substack is really interesting. So I'm going to read what he said about the meaning of life, and I quote: "Some people gaze up at the stars and wonder what it's all about. Me, I gaze up at the stars and wonder why people wonder what it's all about. Why do people do this? It's not at all obvious. We're animals, specifically apes, and pondering the meaning of life is a strange thing for an ape to do. It doesn't get us food or sex. It doesn't keep us safe from predators. It captures our limited attention without providing any obvious Darwinian payoff. So maybe the real mystery isn't the meaning of life, but why apes like us care about the meaning of life." End quote. I don't have any real objection to that, mostly because he's talking about the meaning of life, and we can talk about the meaning of life, I guess, but I think that's a misframing of the question. The question is not about the meaning of life, right? This is not the real question. It's almost a red herring in some sense. The question is about how to live a meaningful life, right? Not what the meaning of life is, but how I can personally live a meaningful life, right? That's the real question that we need to know. But yeah, it's a short article. It's nice. You should go read it. Pinsoff argues, he makes the case that people talk about the meaning of life largely as a way to morally and intellectually justify themselves to other people. They use it to justify their career path, their political loyalties, and other behaviors to their peers. Essentially, it's a form of bullshit, right? Talking about the meaning of life is a form of bullshitting. I think it partly is. I mean, I don't think he's totally wrong about that. I think you can do that, and there is a sense in which our reasoning capacity was formed to justify ourselves to other people. But I think that Pinsoff's general attitude about meaning is wrong. He hasn't read. I mean, it's pretty clear he hasn't read any literature about this stuff, or at least it didn't seem that way to me. But I suspect that Pinsoff's attitude about meaning is pretty common among evolutionary thinkers. He accurately points out that it is a puzzle as to why apes like us would care about meaning. Right? It's not obvious that it gets us food or sex or anything like that. We, like all animals, are evolved to execute our psychological adaptations. Right? We have psychological adaptations, what Nietzsche called drives, but Nietzsche and the evolutionary psychologists are picking up on the same thing. They were formed based on their propensity to help our ancestors achieve higher inclusive fitness relative to the alternative, right? Relative to the alternatives. So we have psychological adaptations, we execute them. And so it's not clear, right? It's not obvious as to why we should care about meaning. So, there is this large empirical literature that has been growing for the last 25 years or so on the causes and consequences of meaning in life, of the subjective sense. You can ask people, do you feel that your life is meaningful? Do you feel that you have purpose or anything like that? And people will tell you. And it turns out that there are a lot of things we can learn about people based on whether they feel that their lives are meaningful. And I think this literature can help us to understand what that is, right? What that subjective sense that my life is meaningful indicates from an evolutionary perspective, right? If we have this subjective sense of meaning, and of course people have been pondering this forever. I mean, people like Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson. These people have sold millions of books. And what's the guy who wrote Man's Search for Meaning? Viktor Frankl, right? Viktor Frankl sold millions of books. Meaning is obviously something that people care deeply about. It's something that speaks to us. And it would be really weird from an evolutionary perspective if we have this thing that we care deeply about, that we talk about all the time, or at least we like to read about it. Not everybody talks about it, but we talk about meaning all the time. But it doesn't have any evolutionary function at all. I mean, it would be unexpected to my mind. Of course, I do think it has an evolutionary function, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. So this literature indicates that self-reported meaning in life reliably correlates with mental and physical health. So, of course, that's a correlate. It doesn't establish causation. But people who lack meaning have worse outcomes basically all around, generally speaking. This literature also indicates that questions about meaning typically arise when people experience highly traumatic events. So losing a close family member, even losing a job, um, having somebody who you trust betray you, right? Like that can definitely do it. When something occurs that shatters our assumptions about the world, we have to go through a process in which we have to either reinterpret the meaning of the event or reinterpret the meaning of the world in order to regain a sense of coherence. My sense is that, evolutionary psychologists, I wish that evolutionary psychologists would pay attention to this literature. Right? Like right now, like nobody's, it's so interesting. There was a recent book called Positive Evolutionary Psychology, written by Glenn Geher and somebody else. I'll put it in the references if I remember to. But it was a book about positive psychology from an evolutionary perspective, and they did not talk about meaning in that book once. I think they mentioned it once, which is so crazy, right? Given the fact that there's this huge literature on meaning and positive, it is an aspect of positive psychology, and that it's so very important to outcomes. Like, it's just so weird that book didn't even touch the subject. It was pointed out by Scott Kaufman in the introduction. So Scott Barry Kaufman wrote the introduction to that book, and he pointed out that, like, it's really weird that they didn't talk about meaning. But I think it's just because evolutionary psychologists don't have a framework within which to understand the adaptive function of meaning. And so hopefully some of them will watch this and be convinced by my argument here. So I am going to argue that when we talk about meaning in life, when we talk about this subjective sense of meaning in life, we are in fact talking about the output of a psychological adaptation, or what you might call an instinct. This instinct must be far older than human beings. My case is that all organisms, especially organisms with complex nervous systems, must have an instinct like this. But of course, we're the only organism that has language. We can talk about it. We can talk about these things. But all organisms must be able to do what I'm going to claim that meaning is doing. To put it succinctly as I can, all animals must find a way to integrate their psychological adaptations and the learned behaviors that facilitate the pursuit of their adaptive goals, such that their adaptive goals are being pursued in a way that doesn't cause too much internal or external conflict. So, for example, we have an instinct to, obviously we have sexual instincts, right? Clearly. We also have instincts to, be a good parent. Those instincts can come into conflict, right? Like they come into conflict all the time. Is there a way to integrate them such that both of those instincts can be satisfied in a way that is integrated both now and across time? Right. Well, if you are able to do that, if you are able to find a solution to this conflict between your instincts, we'll see in a minute how that there's good reason to believe that would be associated with greater meaning in life. So to go on, adaptive goals, along with the beliefs and the perceptions and the behaviors which facilitate pursuit of those goals, often come into conflict with each other, and reducing the behavioral uncertainty associated with that conflict is an adaptive problem facing all organisms with complex nervous systems. Right? What we ought to do in any given situation is not at all apparent to us. Right? We have all sorts of conflicting behavioral affordances that are presenting themselves to us, and we have to reduce those conflicting behavioral affordances down to a single option. Right? We have to collapse it down to a single option, and it's not at all obvious. That how we do that is not at all obvious because it's a very complicated problem. Although this problem faces all complex organisms, it very likely took on an outsized importance in humans because we are far more behaviorally flexible than most animals, meaning that our behavioral affordances are more likely to conflict with each other. The claim that I'm going to make here, and we're going to review evidence for all of this, the claim that I'm going to make here is that when our own goals and beliefs and perceptions and behaviors are functionally integrated, such that there is little conflict or contradiction between them, that is when we experience this sense of meaning in life. When everything is integrated together into a harmonious whole, into an integrated whole. Furthermore, when they are becoming more integrated, we experience that process as meaningful. That happens in the flow state, for example. The flow state is felt as deeply meaningful, and it is a process of becoming more integrated. This process of integration is not palliative, which is what some psychologists have claimed that it's palliative. It's like a comfort thing. It's not for comfort. It is a functional and pragmatic response to a real adaptive problem, which is the problem of behavioral uncertainty, which we're going to talk about in terms of psychological entropy. We're going to look at the psychological entropy framework to set up this adaptive problem. And I think the claims that I've made, and this is the hypothesis we're going to be exploring in this part, I think that they're well supported by a variety of empirical findings, and we're going to review that in this part of the series. So, in part 7, in this part, I need to review a number of ideas related to the psychology of meaning. We're going to look at some ideas about the structure of the mind from evolutionary psychology, especially internal regulatory variables, the concept of an internal regulatory variable, which is a concept from evolutionary psychology, and in motivational systems. And then we're going to look at the psychological entropy framework, which is going to give us a more precise, a more kind of technical, but more precise way of understanding the adaptive problem that this instinct of meaning is meant to solve. And then we're going to look at empirical research, which indicates that the subjective sense of meaning in life tracks psychological integration, and it tracks the process of becoming more integrated. And we're going to look at some of the implications of this for the meaning crisis. And we're also going to look at music. Right? We find music very meaningful, at least anybody, maybe some people don't, but I worry about those people. Many people find music to be very meaningful. And we're going to look at why that would be the case from this perspective. So to put this in the terms of evolutionary psychology, the subjective sense of meaning, I'm going to claim here, is the output of an internal regulatory variable. We have an internal variable, let's say, an internal little, we'll just say a regulatory variable, and it tracks the degree of conflict between behavioral affordances, which will include our goals and our beliefs and our perceptions, right? It tracks conflict, and it has some outputs. One of those outputs is anxiety. When there's a lot of conflict, we feel anxiety. And that's a claim that's been made before. But when there's little conflict, when everything is integrated together, that's when we feel this subjective sense of meaning. So we're now going to talk about evolutionary psychology and the structure of the mind according to evolutionary psychology. I have my hangups about certain aspects of how mainstream evolutionary psychology understands the mind, but I think they've got a lot of things right. So we're not going to try to split hairs here. So evolutionary psychology emerged in large part as a reaction to the idea that has been very historically common among psychologists and social scientists, that the mind, the human mind especially, is a kind of domain general information processor, or if you're a behaviorist, like a stimulus response machine, and that there's little inbuilt content or little inbuilt structure in the mind. And the evolutionary psychologists say, no, this doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? We should come into the world actually with a lot of inbuilt content and inbuilt structure, right? We're not a blank slate or anything close to a blank slate, right? We are not domain general information processors. In fact, we come into the world with a lot of very domain specific psychological mechanisms. So the standard social science model, right, with Tooby and Cosmides, John Tooby and Leda Cosmides are two of the founders of evolutionary psychology. So according to what they call the standard social science model, the mind consists of a few inbuilt instincts like hunger, a sex drive, pain, and pleasure. But for the most part, our psychology is determined through domain general learning. Evolutionary psychologists, on the other hand, argue that the mind consists of a large number of psychological adaptations which have been shaped by our unique evolutionary history. Some evolutionary psychologists, John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, have compared the mind to a smartphone with lots of different apps, right? So our mind has lots of different apps. It has lots of different adaptations for dealing with different adaptive problems. Now, of course, there are ways, don't take the metaphor too literally. Obviously, our mind is not a smartphone. It's way more complicated than that. But the point of this metaphor is just to say that the mind is not a singular entity. It's not a homogeneous thing. And we're not even talking about the brain here, right? We're really talking about the structure of what you might call the mind, right? The software. It has many, what Nietzsche called them drives, right? But it has many different parts to it. So one important concept in evolutionary psychology, it's actually not talked about that much anymore. So it's not talked about much in recent literature, but in the sort of theoretical literature on evolutionary psychology, especially the writing of Tooby and Cosmides, internal regulatory variables are an important concept. And internal regulatory variables function to store. So I'm going to quote Tooby and Cosmides here. They say, the function is to store summary magnitudes or parameters that allow value computation to be integrated into behavior regulation. So these, that's a mouthful, obviously, but these internal regulatory variables, they track fitness relevant contingencies in the environment. So I'll give a couple of examples. You need to estimate, if you're dealing with another person, you need to have some estimate of the extent to which this other person is giving weight to your well-being relative to their own. You need to know how much this person cares about you, basically. And we kind of have, we kind of store a little variable in our mind about how much this person that I'm dealing with gives weight to my well-being in our dealings with other people, right? We kind of, there's an implicit assumption in my mind, this person really cares about me and is going to do a lot for me, and this person doesn't, right? And you need to have estimates of how genetically related you are to other people. So there's a very famous effect called the Westermarck effect, where if you grow up around somebody, you won't be sexually attracted to them, right? And it's because that's a heuristic that we use, and we do it unconsciously. We do it totally unconsciously. It's a heuristic we use to avoid incest, basically. So if you grow up in the same household as somebody, your mind just automatically assumes implicitly, right? It's not like it's consciously doing this. Your mind just automatically assumes, okay, this person is a close relative and I shouldn't have sex with them. So it down-regulates your sexual attraction to somebody who you grew up with. And you also need to have an estimate of the level of infectious disease in your environment. And that feeds into a lot of things. It feeds into like moral and political attitudes. That's a literature called, typically referred to as the behavioral immune system. It's extremely interesting. We're not going to get into it here, but so we need to have, we need to track contingencies in our environment, right? The attitudes that other people have towards us, our genetic relations to other people, so we can decide. It's not only about sex, right? It's also about we're nepotistic towards people who we're related to, and so we want to know if somebody's really related to us. So these internal regulatory variables, right? They feed into other psychological adaptations. So, for example, anger. If somebody is not giving your well-being enough weight, right, compared to what you think they ought to give it, this can induce anger. I don't think it's the only thing that can induce anger, but it's one thing. As we already talked about, sexual arousal, you need to down-regulate sexual arousal to close relatives, and moral and political opinions, even, because there is evidence that people upregulate their support for authoritarian leaders when there are high rates of infectious diseases around. There's a very interesting literature on that stuff. So anyways, that's basically what internal regulatory variables are. One important thing to note here is that the output of an internal regulatory variable, so internal regulatory variables, they track contingencies and they feed into other psychological adaptations, but the psychological adaptations that they feed into may or may not be consciously felt, right? And it's the case that many or most of our adaptations function in the absence of any awareness of them on our part. So Tooby and Cosmides say about this, and I quote, that, for example, the kidneys are equipped with an internal regulatory variable that registers levels of oxygen in the blood. When blood oxygen falls below a certain threshold value, this stimulates the production of erythropoietin, a hormone that triggers maturation of red blood cells in the bone marrow. This is unaccompanied by any felt experience. The brain does not seem to have any design feature capable of consciously representing levels of erythropoietin or blood oxygen, end quote. And so a lot of internal regulatory variables function unconsciously. Other outputs of internal regulatory variables, like anger or sexual arousal, are obviously consciously felt. Tooby and Cosmides put forward a number of suggestions in their 2014 paper talking about this stuff as to why it is the case that some Some outputs of internal regulatory variables are consciously felt and others aren't. They suggest that when the information associated with the internal regulatory variable needs to be made available to a large number of other psychological mechanisms, then that information will be broadcast across the brain and will be made conscious. And I find that suggestion very interesting and plausible because it's perfect. So we talked about consciousness in part 4. I think it is totally consistent with what we talked about in the part on consciousness, especially global workspace theory, because global workspace theory simply suggests that consciousness is global information broadcasting within the cortex. And it makes perfect sense that the internal regulatory variables, if the information needs to be made available to a large number of psychological mechanisms, it will be made conscious. That makes a lot of sense to me. They say, and I quote, that some felt experiences may be a data format by which the mind broadcasts in a way that is accessible to many other mechanisms the magnitude of certain internal regulatory variables, end quote. Yeah, that's what meaning is, as far as I'm concerned, right? So meaning is, the subjective sense of meaning in life is a felt experience that is conscious because it needs to be, because it's such a general aspect of the world that it needs to be made available to many other psychological mechanisms. And so I am going to suggest, I say later on my slide, I'm going to suggest it right now, actually, that the felt experience of meaning in life is just this kind of output, right? It's a way to broadcast the magnitude of a certain internal regulatory variable that is tracking psychological integration, essentially. All right, so moving on now to talk about motivation, motivation from an evolutionary perspective. So there's a very influential paper by Doug Kenrick and colleagues. Doug Kenrick is a very prominent evolutionary psychologist, in which they put forward a taxonomy of fundamental motivations. And they arranged these in a hierarchy, and they were kind of loosely basing this on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow never made a hierarchy, by the way, but that's irrelevant for the moment. So the fundamental motivations that they point out are immediate physiological needs. So these are the obvious ones like food and water and shelter, self-protection, affiliation. We're very social creatures. We need to be embedded in a social group. Status or esteem. We strive, either directly or indirectly. We strive for status. Mate acquisition. We have to find someone who wants to reproduce with us, or at least have sex with us. In the past, sex generally led to reproduction. We can kind of disconnect those today, but generally speaking, that wasn't the case. Mate retention. We have to keep our mates if we want to. And parenting. And they put parenting at the top. So these are what they call the fundamental motivations. I don't have a big problem with. I think this is a fine list of fundamental motivations. There are probably different ways that you could slice things up, but they left out the big one, as far as I'm concerned. So these authors base their hierarchy very loosely on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow himself puts self-actualization at the top of the hierarchy. These authors claim that self-actualization should not be considered a real fundamental motivation. They say about this, and I quote, that among other things, considerations at the functional level of analysis suggest that, although self-actualization may be of considerable psychological importance, it is unlikely to be a functionally distinct human need. Consequently, we have removed self-actualization from its privileged place at the top of the pyramid and suggest that it is largely subsumed within status and mating-related motives in the new framework. End quote. Wrong. You're wrong, Kenrick and colleagues, okay? And I say that with much love, but you're dead wrong. These authors have very seriously misunderstood what self-actualization is, and they have erroneously discarded it as a fundamental motivation. Self-actualization is not just a fundamental motivation, as far as I'm concerned, it's the fundamental motivation, because self-actualization is fundamentally about integration. They think, I think they maybe didn't read Maslow closely enough or didn't understand, but excuse me. So they think it's mostly about creative activity. And that's, generally speaking, creative activity is one path towards integration, but it's far from the only one. And Maslow talks about other paths as well. But self-actualization is fundamentally about psychological integration. And it ought to go at the top of the hierarchy. We're going to come back to that much later on. So that's going to be towards the conclusion of part 7. But Kenrick and colleagues say about this, and I quote, that by removing self-actualization from our renovated pyramid of needs, we in no way diminish the phenomenological or psychological importance of self-actualization itself. But neither phenomenological nor psychological importance is sufficient argument to accord self-actualization the status of a functionally distinct motive or need. By removing self-actualization from the pyramid, we simply recognize that its privileged position cannot be compelled nor justified by the functional logic of human evolutionary biology. End quote. Wrong. You're wrong, Kenrick and colleagues. It is the function of it is integration over time and among the different other motivations and behavioral affordances in general. That's the function of the what you might call the instinct of self-actualization. And as I said, what Maslow called self-actualization is not only a fundamental motivation, it is the fundamental motivation. It goes at the top of the hierarchy, or it ought to go at the top of the hierarchy. And all other motivations can be thought of as being subordinate to self-actualization because the meta goal, right? So we have goals, right? So as evolved creatures, right, we have these goals that we are biologically hardwired to pursue: status, sex, affiliation, blah, blah, blah. But the meta goal is to be able to pursue those goals in a way that is integrated both internally and externally across time. So we have to pursue those goals in such a way that we don't generate too much internal conflict between the goals. We don't want to generate too much conflict between ourselves and the external world, the social group, generally speaking. And we also need to be integrated across time. Okay, well, that's what self-actualization is. It is that kind of integration, that forming yourself into a harmonious whole. And the instinct of meaning, or the subjective sense of meaning, is what we pursue to attain self-actualization. So Kenrick and colleagues say that a functional, and that it doesn't have a function, but they don't understand the function of it. Sorry, like they misread Maslow. Maslow was clear, at least in some places, he was clear that what self-actualization is integration. But we're going to come back to that later on. So the fundamental problem. So, if we're going to talk about meaning as an instinct or as a psychological adaptation, we have to set up the adaptive problem that it's meant to solve. And one way of thinking about the adaptive problem is that it's about conflict between behavioral affordances. But in order to really understand that problem, we have to kind of come at it from a different perspective. We have to come at it from the perspective of complexity. The fundamental problem that's facing any organism, I will argue here, echoing others, is not to avoid death or to attain reproductive success, right? Those are problems that you have to solve as an organism, but those are really subsidiary problems. The fundamental problem can be understood as complexity management, or as the management of complexity. And the problem is basically just the fact that the world is way more complex than we are, and way more complex than our cognitive models of it can ever be. Our action-oriented cognitive models or representations of it. And that's a problem, right? We cannot represent the world as it is. It's too complicated, but we have to act in it to fulfill our goals anyways. Peterson and Flanders in this 2001 paper put it this way. They said, and I quote, that we can only make sense of a fraction of the information that constantly presents itself to us. The stability of the sense that we make is therefore fragile. Our models of experience are limited, incomplete, and chronically prone to failure. Our essential existential problem can thus be conceptualized as vulnerability to complexity, with subjugation to death appearing as a non-trivial but far from identical consequence of this more basic vulnerability. End quote. The problem of complexity is essentially the same as the frame problem, right? And it's the same as the problem that motivated John Vervaeke's concept of relevance realization. Peterson and Flanders say elsewhere that, and I quote, that most simply, the frame problem is the problem of relevance, or more accurately, irrelevance. There are a vast number of things that will not change in the course of any limited action, at least not in any important manner, but there are some that do. How can what does not change be determined and ignored, while what does change and what is relevant be attended to and processed? Right? This is the frame problem. This is the problem of complexity. It's the problem of navigating an infinitely complex world as a very finite creature. It's the fundamental problem that we have, as far as I'm concerned. Peterson and Flanders go on to say about this, and I quote, that the frame problem is not restricted in its importance to explorers of silicon and electricity. Right? It's not restricted to computers and robots. On the contrary, artificial intelligences encounter with the frame problem exposed the fundamental inadequacy of the naive realism underpinning cognitive science and biological extension psychology. Let me stop there for a second. This is my main problem with the theoretical foundations of evolutionary psychology to some extent. I don't think that they deal with the problem of complexity appropriately, right? Like, and I use the theoretical framework of evolutionary psychology all the time because I think it rightly points to the fact that we have many domain-specific psychological adaptations, and it presents that as a kind of solution to this problem, but it's not really a solution. Yeah, so moving on. So reading on it, they say, and I quote, "It has become painfully clear that whatever constitutes the definitive boundary of the objects that we manipulate, both concretely and abstractly, is not something simply intrinsic to those objects. Every object can be classified, even perceived, in an infinite number of manners." And let me stop there again. This is the problem, right? This is the problem of perception. Right? Like, how do we even perceive objects? This is not at all clear, in terms of trying to build a system that can perceive in the way that we do, in the flexible manner that we do. We haven't really done anything yet that can do that. We build systems that can do it in a limited domain, right? In a specific domain, but not in the very general way that we can do it. Every object must therefore be regarded as something infinitely complex, objectively, intrinsically. We live in a virtual sea of complexity and uncertainty. We frame an object by cutting away vast swaths of information, indisputably associated with that object, but irrelevant to our current purposes, however those might be subjectively construed. Lacking subjectively determined constraint, therefore, even the most powerful information processors cannot compute the explosive complexity of the object, cannot even reliably define the edges of a regular solid under changing conditions of lighting or position. We can do that these days, I think, within a controlled domain. I think we have some programs that can do things like that, but not in a domain general way. And they go on to say, and I quote, that from an evolutionary perspective, we appear primarily concerned with action and its consequences rather than with representation. The fundamental requirement to survive and replicate provides us at some indeterminate remove with an a priori set of values or goals and with a ceaseless, although bounded, challenge. How can we achieve our intrinsically determined ends in an endlessly complex environment? End quote. Okay, so that's the fundamental problem of complexity, right? We come into the world with a priori values, right? Our biologically mediated values, things that we can't get away from, right? That are a part of our constitution, right? Like the fact that we get hungry. Okay, no getting out of that. We're always going to get hungry, right? We have other motivations that are always going to be there. They're a part of us. They're a part of what we are, and we have to. We don't have a choice in it. Like, it's just what we are is the pursuit of those values in this sea of complexity, and we have to figure out how to pursue those values in an integrated way. Right? That's the basic problem in this sea of complexity. So the difference between our conceptualizations of the world, which are action-oriented, right? So we don't really represent the world, right? What we do is we have a map of the world that facilitates our appropriate action in the world. Right? It's something like that. Like a mental map that is action-oriented. And it's the difference between that map, you might say, and the sensory input that we receive from the world, which can be understood as psychological entropy. So this is what we're going to talk about next, as the psychological entropy framework. So because the world is too complex for us to deal with, we have to have simplified, conceptualizations of it. And because those conceptualizations are more simple than the world, they're always going to come up with errors, right? There's always going to be errors associated with them. And the difference between our conceptualizations and the sensory input we receive from the world can be understood in terms of psychological entropy or uncertainty. So the psychological entropy framework is the next thing we're going to talk about. And it's related to the problem of complexity, right? You can conceptualize, well, I'm just going to read the abstract. So Hirsch, Marr, and Peterson in this 2012 paper, which was called the Psychological Entropy Framework. This is the abstract of that paper. And I think it's necessary. We just want to get a sort of big picture overview of what psychological entropy is. So they say, and I quote, that entropy, a concept derived from thermodynamics and information theory, describes the amount of uncertainty and disorder within a system. Self-organizing systems engage in a continual dialogue with the environment, and they must adapt themselves to changing circumstances to keep internal entropy at a manageable level. We propose the entropy model of uncertainty, an integrative theoretical framework that applies the idea of entropy to the human information system to understand uncertainty-related anxiety. 4 major tenets of the entropy model of uncertainty are proposed. In the first place, the first tenet is that uncertainty poses a critical adaptive challenge for any organism, so individuals are motivated to keep it at a manageable level. The second tenet is that uncertainty emerges as a function of the conflict between competing perceptual and behavioral affordances. Let me stop there for a second. Uncertainty emerges as a function of the conflict between competing perceptual and behavioral affordances. So when we have a behavioral affordance or a perceptual affordance, this is a term that comes from Gibsonian psychology. We don't need to get a technical understanding of it. It's like an option that's available to us, right? So like, just as a trivial example, you go to a party and you tell a joke and you offend people, right? Well, what should you do in that situation? And it's not at all clear, right? Like, it's not at all clear what your emotional reaction should be. It's not at all clear how you should respond to that. It depends heavily on the context, right? Because maybe your joke was actually really crass and you're really rude and you should feel really bad about it. And maybe you should go home and cry for the next week. Or maybe the people that you're interacting with are humorless prudes and they're being really rude, and maybe you should be kind of mad at them, and maybe you should go find another party to go to and screw those guys, right? There's all sorts of ways that you could react to that. But you can only do one thing. And so if you have competing behavioral affordances, right, well, then you've got a problem, right? Because you can't do everything. You've got to do one thing. And if you have competing behavioral affordances, that's anxiety, right? So within this framework, that's what they are saying anxiety is. And I think that's generally the case. So moving on, the third tenet of the entropy model of uncertainty is that adopting clear goals and belief structures helps to constrain the experience of uncertainty by reducing the spread of competing affordances. Let me stop again. Clear goals and belief structures are going to integrate you. I mean, that's what they do. To clarify your beliefs about things is to reduce the conflict between conflicting beliefs. And to clarify your goals is to reduce the conflict between conflicting goals. If you want to lose weight, for example, there's going to be a conflict between your desire to lose weight and your desire to eat chocolate cake at night. Right? Like these are competing behavioral affordances that have to be collapsed down to a single behavioral affordance. Moving on, the fourth and final tenet of the entropy model of uncertainty is that uncertainty is experienced subjectively as anxiety and is associated with activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. By placing the discussion of uncertainty management, a fundamental biological necessity within the framework of information theory and self-organizing systems, our model helps to situate key psychological processes within a broader physical, conceptual, and evolutionary context, end quote. So that's the entropy model of uncertainty. So my claim is that the subjective sense of meaning is the output of a psychological adaptation. And if we're talking about a psychological adaptation, we need to have the adaptive problem be clear. And so I'm going to read something that was written by Hirsch Jacob Hirsch in 2012, which I think will help to clarify what this adaptive problem is. And we've talked about this, already, but I think his expression of it is really good, and I think it'll clarify some things. So, to quote Hirsch, he says that in any given situation, the brain is always trying to compute the optimal behavioral response based upon the currently perceived state of the world, the desired state of the world, and beliefs about how to turn the latter into the former. Let me stop there for a second. Okay, that's the basic structure of a frame. That's what a frame is, essentially. You have the initial state, the goal state, and then the beliefs about how you're going to move from the initial state to the goal state, right? And our brain, we have a hierarchy of frames in some sense, with more abstract frames and more particular and concrete frames. Moving on, he says, and I quote, that in our entropy model of uncertainty, we conceptualize the range of possible actions that can be brought to bear on a given situation as a probability distribution. In some situations, the optimal response is fairly evident, and only a single behavioral affordance is activated. Such situations are characterized by familiarity and deeply routinized behavioral patterns, and a low entropy distribution where only a single dominant response is highly activated. So let me stop there for a second. Those are situations of order. Right? Those are situations where you know what you need to do. What you need to do is obvious and clear. When the light turns green, hit the gas pedal. Right? Like that's the about as clear as it gets. The behavioral affordance is obvious. There's low entropy. Individuals in this state are relatively disinhibited, focusing only on the most salient response option. Conversely, other situations are characterized by the simultaneous activation of competing action tendencies, such as when we are unsure whether we should approach or avoid an unfamiliar situation. These situations are characterized by uncertainty about the appropriate response, expressed as a high entropy distribution of potential actions, where many competing behaviors receive similar levels of activation. He goes on a little later to say, and I quote, that animals who are not able to identify the appropriate pragmatic response to a situation will not survive, nor will those who reduce their anxiety without addressing the underlying problem. The underlying problem from a pragmatic perspective is the fundamental existential question of what should I do? End quote. And so what should I do in the face of competing behavioral affordances, right? You need a way to collapse those down to a singular affordance, and you want that to be the most functional behavior that you can possibly manifest in that situation. And the subjective sense of meaning, right, tells you that your behavioral affordances are integrated together and there's no real conflict between them. Right? I mean, that's what the subjective sense of meaning is doing. And behavioral affordances manifest not only just as actions you could possibly take in the world, but also your beliefs as well, because your beliefs affect your behavior. Right? Your beliefs about what the world is actually like clearly have an effect on your behavior. And so you want there to be little conflict between your beliefs as well. So moving on now to talk about the evolved function of meaning, and we're going to get into some of the empirical research on meaning in life. So just to be clear about this, I want to avoid confusion. We're talking about meaning here as an experience or a mental state, and not as an ontological category. So we talk about the meaning of words, for example, or the meaning of a painting. That's not really what I'm talking about here, right? We're talking about the meaningfulness that somebody feels in their life, right? It's an experience. Klinger, in 1997, captures this in this quote. He says, and I quote, that the meaningfulness of someone's life cannot be inferred just from knowing his or her objective circumstances. Meaningfulness is something very subjective, a pervasive quality of a person's inner life. It is experienced both as ideas and as emotions. It is clear, then, that when we ask about the meaningfulness of someone's life, we are asking about the qualities of his or her inner experience, right? So, end quote. So it's an inner experience. We can measure it the same way that we measure other constructs in psychology. We just ask people, basically. Steger, based on the empirical research around meaning in life, Steger defined meaning in life as and I quote, "The web of connections, understandings, and interpretations that help us comprehend our experience and formulate plans directing our energies to the achievement of our desired future. Meaning provides us with the sense that our lives matter, that they make sense, and that they are more than the sum of our seconds, days, and years." End quote. So we're going to look at that and why that's related to the empirical research around meaning in life. And why that's related, all that is related to psychological integration. So we're going to discuss meaning as two things, really. They're related to each other, but we're going to discuss them separately because there is meaning in life as this sort of mood that you can have, right? And we're going to use mood in a technical way. I'm going to introduce Marco del Giudice's idea of what a mood is in the technical sense. But there's the mood that we can have that our lives are meaningful, right? So if you ask somebody, is your life meaningful? And they say, man, my life is intensely meaningful. Okay, well, that's what we mean by mood. But there's also the sense that some experiences are meaningful, right? So you might ask somebody, somebody might say that they had a really meaningful conversation with somebody. And then, there's also like meaningless chit chat, right? And so what's the difference? So some experiences can be felt as meaningful. So we have these two kind of separate things, right? So we have meaning as just a general sense that your life is meaningful, but we also say that certain experiences are meaningful. And those are related, but they're different. And so we're going to talk about them differently. This video, the rest of this video, is going to be about meaning in life as a mood. And then in the next video, we're going to look at empirical research around the experience, that particular experiences are meaningful. So there is a large empirical literature on the causes and consequences of the subjective sense of meaning in life. That literature suggests that there are three components to meaning in life. Let me back up a little bit. I said that we were going to talk about Marco del Giudice's framework. I actually took that out because it was taking up too much time. So we're not going to talk about that. But the point is that a mood is something that's different from an emotion. A mood is something that occurs over a longer time span, and it coordinates a lot of stuff that emotions wouldn't coordinate, right? So if like you're in a good mood, it's different from an emotion, right? It's something that occurs over a little bit of a longer span of time. One of the reasons I use the word mood is because Marco suggests that moods can involve compensatory efforts, and we're going to talk about how there are compensatory efforts to restore meaning when meaning is lost. And so that makes it something like a mood. So this literature on meaning in life identifies three components, three aspects of meaning in life. And these three aspects are coherence or comprehension, and purpose, and significance or mattering. So coherence, purpose, and significance. Coherence is sometimes called comprehension. Significance is sometimes called mattering. There are some people like John Vervaeke thinks that mattering should be a separate thing from significance. I don't think so. It's not a big difference. It's not really a big deal, but I think that mattering and significance are essentially the same. But and that is the consensus really within the literature. But what I'm going to argue here is that all of these are different manifestations of psychological integration. We're going to see how all of these are just different components of being psychologically integrated. All right, so the first aspect or facet of meaning in life is coherence, sometimes called comprehension. Usually I see it called coherence in the literature. And so these are items measuring comprehension or coherence. They include things like I can make sense of the things that happen in my life, and looking at my life as a whole, things seem clear to me. I'm going to read what King and Hicks. So King and Hicks have a recent review paper of the psychology of meaning in life. I think they do a good job of summarizing all this stuff. So I'm going to read what they said about coherence or comprehension. They said, and I quote, that focusing on the comprehension aspect of meaning, the feeling of meaning as information model, views the subjective state of meaningfulness as providing information about the extent to which the world and experience make sense. This perspective relies on William James's notion of the feeling of right direction as an indicator of the subjective rationality of experience, tying the experience of meaning to the adaptive processes of associative learning and the automatic detection of covariation in the environment. This perspective suggests that when the environment is predictable and rich with systematic associations, the feeling of meaning is likely to be high. When meaning in life is low, it signals the need to seek out patterns and associations. From this perspective, just as moods provide important information that directs thought and activities, so too does the feeling of meaning. End quote. A few things I want to point out there. So when the environment is rich with systematic associations, right? Like that's really what coherence is about. Where things in your world are intelligibly related to each other such that everything makes sense and fits into an integrated whole, right? Then it seems as if the world is a coherent and comprehensible place, and that is associated with the feeling of meaning in life. Interestingly enough, they also call it a mood, which is nice because it means I'm not the only person saying that. The feeling of meaning, the sense of meaning in life is kind of like a mood that we have. And one of the aspects of that mood is whether or not the world makes sense to us, whether or not it's coherent and comprehensible. My suggestion is that the comprehension aspect of meaning in life indicates to us that our beliefs and perceptions are integrated, such that there is little contradiction between them. So moving on to purpose. Purpose is the second facet or aspect of meaning. Purpose, I'm going to suggest, reflects our integration across time through the pursuit of valued and appropriate goals. So when we have a clear goal structure and we value these goals, we feel like our lives are purposeful, that they have purpose. And so King and Hicks say, and I quote, that purpose reflects the feeling that one's behavior is guided by personally valued goals. Purposeful goal pursuits are often consistent with core aspects of identity and may contribute to the development of self-knowledge itself. Although goals and motivations are central to the concept of purposeful living, purpose in life encompasses more than goal pursuit. As McKnight and Cashton state, purpose is a central, self-organizing life aim that organizes and stimulates goals, manages behaviors, and provides a sense of meaning. Overarching purpose leads to efficient, self-regulatory strategies, rendering relevant proximal goals salient and facilitating decision-making and resulting in greater goal commitment and engagement. Questionnaire items tapping purpose include, I have a good sense of what I'm trying to accomplish in life, and I have certain goals that compel me to keep going. End quote. So this is why so when Maslow talked about self-actualization, he often talked about it in the context of creative endeavors, but not always, right? He also talked about it in terms of like being a good parent can lead to self-actualization. But creative endeavors are a really common way of seeing this, simply because if you're somebody who's a creative person and you have something that's really gripped you, like you have purpose at that point. Like the purpose of your life is not in question, right? If you're like creating something that really means something to you, the idea that your life lacks purpose, it doesn't even make, and it organizes you, right? Because everything becomes organized in relation to that purpose, right? Everything becomes judged in relation to that purpose. So it provides a clear hierarchy of values, and that means that the salience or the relevance of things in the world becomes more clear, because now you have a clear purpose, you have a clear direction in life, and everything, you can self-organize around that purpose. And so it facilitates integration. Jacob Hirsch, in a 2010 paper, said that, and I quote, to the extent that competing goals promote multiple interpretations of a single event, more experiential uncertainty should occur. Existential uncertainty and the resulting anxiety may thus be usefully reduced by clarifying the goal structures that guide behavior, thereby providing a more clearly defined framework for interpreting the meaning of one's experiences. End quote. Yes, so having clear goals, right? Having clear goals makes it makes the world appear more certain in some sense, because not certain. It makes your options more clear. Right? It tells you what's relevant and what's irrelevant, right? If you have real goals that you actually value, the relevance of things in the world becomes much more clear, and that's associated with the subjective sense of meaning in life. So the third one is significance or mattering. To quote King and Hicks here, they say, and I quote, that the notion of existential mattering or significance refers to the extent to which a person believes their life counts. That is, that their existence has and will have a lasting impact on the world. Mattering is tied to the belief that one's existence will continue to influence others across time and space. Items tapping a sense of existential mattering include whether my life ever existed matters, even in the grand scheme of the universe. And even considering how big the universe is, I can say that my life matters. Strong evidence for the importance of mattering to meaning is provided by research on social exclusion. The most consistent effect of social exclusion, manipulated in a number of ways, is a drop in feelings that one's existence matters. End quote. My contention here is that this aspect of meaning in life is picking up on your integration. It's picking up on your integration into the social world. You need to be integrated externally into the social world. You need to pursue your goals in a way that either other people aren't going to punish you for doing it, but you would rather them like reward you and like you more for pursuing your actual goals. And so when you're integrated into the social world in that way, you feel like you have a sense of significance or mattering. But it doesn't necessarily have to be social per se. It just has to be that you are contributing to something that is larger than you, right? Something that is, and that generally involves social or moral or political movements and things like that. Yeah. So we're now going to move on to talk about the meaning maintenance model. And so Marco del Giudice, who is my former advisor, wrote this really nice paper a couple years ago about the structure of motivation from an evolutionary perspective. And I'm going to read what he said here about moods, because I think it's really nice to conceptualize the subjective sense of meaning in life as a mood in the way that he frames it here. So he says, and I quote, that as third-order coordination programs, moods are not driven by specific events, but by integrative evaluations of the state of the organism in relation to the environment. In this sense, they are harder to regulate than emotions or motivations, and less susceptible to targeted strategies such as reappraisal and suppression. On the other hand, the fact that mood mechanisms integrate over multiple inputs creates some opportunities for regulation that are not available to lower-order mechanisms. For example, it becomes possible to employ compensatory strategies so that success in one motivational domain balances out failure in another. End quote. Well, that's very interesting, because that is precisely what we find with meaning in life. That you can engage in compensatory strategies, and this is what's known as the meaning maintenance model, or at least that's one theory about it. So when our meaning in life is threatened in one domain, we can compensate by sort of holding on tighter to our meaning in other domains. We can engage in compensatory behavior to maintain our overall state of meaning. So Dehaene and colleagues in their 2006 paper on the meaning maintenance model say this about it, and I quote, that at the heart of the meaning maintenance model is the proposition that when people experience a disruption to meaning frameworks, they attempt to reconstruct meaning through other relational structures that are available and intact. Because this compensation is proposed to be fluid, evidence for meaning construction efforts is anticipated not only in the same domain as the original threat, but also in domains far removed from the source of the threat. Although we submit that the first line of defense to a meaning threat would be to try to respond to the threat directly, and only affirm alternative meaning frameworks if the present one is damaged beyond repair. End quote. And so, when we experience a disruption to our meaning, we can compensate, and we can fluidly compensate, even in domains that are far removed from the source of the threat. So if your meaning is threatened in terms of your significance, let's say, your integration in the social world, you can compensate for that by focusing on other goals that you have, right? By focusing on your purpose, let's say. And that actually works, right? It actually serves to maintain an overall sense of meaning in life. So my contention, as I've said, is that the existence of fluid compensation with meaning in life indicates that this subjective sense of meaning is best thought of as a mood, as was conceptualized by Marco del Giudice in his 2021 paper. So emotions coordinate actions over relatively short periods of time. Moods are longer term. They play a longer term role in regulating behavior. So Marco del Giudice says about this, and I quote, that from the standpoint of the extended coordination approach, moods are easily understood as the product of third-order coordination mechanisms that A, receive information from motivational systems about success and failure in the pursuit of domain-specific goals, B, compute integrative estimates of the present or future state of the organism in relation to its environment, and C, strategically modulate the functioning of multiple motivational systems, not just by activating or inhibiting them, but also by selectively influencing their sensitivity to threats and versus opportunities. End quote. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a good description of what meaning in life seems to be doing based on the empirical research. Yeah, I think it's best understood in terms of a mood. So within the meaning maintenance model, right, people engage in what are called these compensatory strategies. So Proulx and Inzlicht, I think that's how you say that name, in their 2012 paper, say this about this fluid compensation. They say, and I quote, that these studies test the true boundaries of fluid compensation. Implicit inconsistencies provoke explicit compensation. Violations of propositional whats provoke the affirmation of moral whys, with mortality and other nonsense provoking the affirmation of something else that makes sense. In sum, the true boundaries of fluid compensation are not defined by content, but by meaning. So if you're skeptical about that, you should go read their paper. I think they provide a good amount of evidence for this, that our meaning, our meaning making is very fluid. We can compensate, for a threat in one domain by bolstering another domain, even if it's very unrelated to the domain that the threat was in. And so this literature indicates that we have this innate and typically unconscious desire for our values and goals and beliefs and perceptions to remain integrated. And when we experience disintegration, right, when they become disintegrated through expectancy violations, we can compensate for this by bolstering that integration in a totally different domain sometimes. Now, my suggestion is that this means that we have an internal regulatory variable, as the evolutionary psychologists would posit, which tracks the overall level of integration, or conversely, you could say that it tracks conflict between behavioral affordances, but it's tracking the overall integration. And that internal regulatory variable feeds into psychological mechanisms that promote these compensatory behaviors, which restore integration when it is lost. And one of the outputs of that internal regulatory variable is just our subjective feeling of meaning in life. So we now need to move on to talk about something else. We need to talk about worldviews, right? The name of this series of videos is Intimations of a New Worldview, and it is a response to the meaning crisis. Right? So what do worldviews have to do with meaning, right? And why are they important to meaning? What role do culturally provided worldviews, which is most commonly religions, what role do they play in our capacity to establish and maintain meaning? So I think Cultco Rivera provides a nice definition of a worldview. So they say, and I quote, that a worldview is a way of describing the universe and life within it, both in terms of what is and what ought to be. So worldviews include both descriptions of reality, but also value judgments. A given worldview is a set of beliefs that includes limiting statements and assumptions regarding what exists and what does not, either in actuality or in principle, what objects or experiences are good or bad, and what objectives, behaviors, and relationships are desirable or undesirable. A worldview defines what can be known or done in the world and how it can be known or done. In addition to defining what goals can be sought in life, a worldview defines what goals should be pursued. Worldviews include assumptions that may be unproven and unprovable, but these assumptions are superordinate in that they provide the epistemic and ontological foundations for other beliefs within a belief system. End quote. Worldviews go at the top of the hierarchy, right? Like that's what they are. Like, so, we have a hierarchy of beliefs and values and perceptions and goals and all that. Like the worldview questions, the questions that make up a worldview are what goes at the top, and everything else is nested inside of them. Right, like that's what he's getting at here. Ann Taves and colleagues in the 2018 paper which I think is a really great paper for anybody interested in this stuff. It'll be in the references. They take an evolutionary perspective on worldviews, and they suggest that all organisms must at least implicitly have answers to certain kinds of questions. They say, and I quote, "We take a building block approach that situates worldviews in a comparative evolutionary perspective. Doing so allows us to identify a core set of world and self-making capacities that humans share with other animals, and upon which the human ability to elaborate worldviews rests. Even in their most basic form, these world and self-making capacities enable organisms to make sense of their environment, and thus represent primitive versions of the meaning-making abilities that humans use to make sense of situations and events." And so Taves and colleagues here I'm in agreement with them about the fact that our capacity to make meaning is not it's not something that's unique to humans. All animals must do it. We can talk about it and they can't. But every animal, every complex organism has to have this instinct to remain integrated, right? To remain integrated. Now, our psychology is so much more complex in other organisms that it's very likely that that instinct is more elaborated in human beings than other animals. But every animal has to do this. And so every animal must have answers to certain questions. Now, of course, in other animals, those answers are going to be implicit in the sense that they're going to be acted out and not explicitly verbalized, because, of course, animals can't talk. But they have to have implicit answers to certain questions. And these are the big questions that make up a worldview, according to Taves and colleagues. And I agree. I think these are the basic worldview questions. And you could probably slice them up a little bit differently, but I think they do a good job of laying them out. So they say the big questions are, in the first place, ontology, which is what is real, what exists, and what's the difference between what is real and unreal for the organism. Axiology, what should it strive for? What are its goals? Praxeology, which is how does the organism act? How do I act? What do I do in order to achieve those goals? And epistemology, which is how do I know what is true about the world? And these big questions that make up a worldview are very important from the perspective of psychological entropy. So as we've talked about, the mind is arranged in this kind of hierarchy of abstraction, and the worldview questions are at the top. And so all of our subsidiary goals and beliefs are nested inside of our answers to the big questions. Now, for most people, the answers to the big questions are not really explicit, right? For most people are not philosophers, right? And that's totally fine. The answers to most people don't have an elaborated philosophy of epistemology. Right? They have implicit assumptions about how they know what is true, and they don't have an elaborated ontology. Right? They have implicit assumptions about what is real and unreal. But nevertheless, those implicit assumptions are still of vital importance, because your assumptions about what is real and unreal tells you, it constrains what you can possibly believe in, because something that presents itself to your sensory experience that you have a priori deemed as being impossible, it's very likely that you'll deny that or find some explanation for it that deems it unreal in some important sense. So disruptions to our answers to the big questions, right? If we allow those to be disrupted, that will generate a lot more psychological entropy than other kinds of disruptions, because everything that was nested inside of them also becomes disrupted. Hirsch and colleagues, in their 2012 paper on psychological entropy, they talk about this. So they don't talk about it in terms of worldviews, but they're talking about the same phenomenon, right? What happens when the highest level of the hierarchy is disrupted? And so this is what they had to say about that. And I quote, "The dissolution of these more abstract self-goals has broader implications than the loss of simple behavioral goals. So the concomitant increase of psychological entropy is greater and more widespread. Disrupting a higher order goal means that behavioral and perceptual affordances previously constrained by this goal are suddenly allowed to vary freely. Accordingly, while challenges to lower order goals may lead to relatively minor experiences of anxiety, instantiated as a slight and temporary flattening of the distribution of possible actions and interpretive frames, challenges to an individual's higher order goals can lead to states of profound behavioral and affective destabilization, instantiated as a rapid flattening of the perceptual and behavioral probability distributions across multiple situations, end quote. Now, that applies equally to the high-level beliefs we have and not just goals. And we're going to look at an example of this here in just a minute of somebody who had their high-level goals essentially disrupted, and what that did to them psychologically. We're going to look at Tolstoy here in just a minute. So the importance of worldviews, right, to our subjective sense of meaning, the fact that they constrain entropy by constraining everything that is nested inside of them. This makes it easier to understand why it is that so many intellectuals experienced crises of meaning, personal crises of meaning, in response to what Nietzsche called the death of God. And they expressed that in multiple ways. But we see, these are the existentialists, right? They expressed their angst, their anxiety, that the world now appears meaningless. A true worldview crisis does this, right? It generates a huge amount of psychological entropy. And my suspicion, there are many people who doubt that there is any such thing as a meaning crisis. And my suspicion is that these are people who generally lack a historical sense. They don't understand, right, just how, nihilism is the water that we swim in as modern people. Right? We don't see it because it's just the water that we swim in. And I think that people just aren't really aware of just how different the world is that we occupy now is from the world that our ancestors just a couple hundred years ago occupied. And we don't experience the acuteness of the meaning crisis because we were born into it. But for those who went through it, right, as it was happening, it was a profound psychological crisis for many people. And so we are going to look at Leo Tolstoy, the author Leo Tolstoy, and his description of the meaning crisis for him personally. And I'm going to read this at length. I'm going to read a lengthy quote here because I think it's important. I think it's important to get a sense of what the meaning crisis is from this psychological perspective, because this is what Tolstoy was experiencing. He was experiencing personally the meaning crisis, and it was because his worldview had been disrupted. Right? He was a successful person, nice family, nice wife, good friends, respect, all of this, but he almost committed suicide because his life lacked meaning, because his worldview had been disrupted. So we're going to read this. This was published in 1887. So this was the end of the 19th century, just 5 years after Nietzsche announced the death of God and the gay science. I doubt that Tolstoy had read that. Nietzsche's work didn't become popular until later, but Tolstoy is experiencing what Nietzsche announced in his book. So this is what Tolstoy said about that, and I quote: "I remember that when I was 11 years old, a high school boy named Volodin, now long since dead, visited us one Sunday with an announcement of the latest discovery made at school. The discovery was that there is no God, and that the things they were teaching us were nothing but fairy tales. This was in 1838. I remember how this news captured the interest of my older brothers. They even let me in on their discussions. I remember that we were all very excited, and that we took this news to be both engaging and entirely possible." I'm going to pause here. What I'm going to read next is a little, the way he's written this is a little hard to understand, but I'll unpack it when I get done. He said, and I quote, that "Since ancient times, when the life of which I do know something began, people who knew the arguments concerning the vanity of life, the arguments that revealed to me its meaninglessness, lived nonetheless, bringing to life a meaning of their own. Since the time when people somehow began to live, this meaning of life has been with them, and they have led this life up to my own time. Everything that is in me and around me is the fruit of their knowledge of life. The very tools of thought by which I judge life and condemn it were created, not by me, but by them. I myself was born, educated, and have grown up thanks to them. They dug out the iron, taught us how to cut the timber, tamed the cattle and horses, showed us how to sow crops and live together. They brought order to our lives. They taught me how to think and speak. I am their offspring, nursed by them, reared by them, taught by them. I think according to their thoughts, their words, and now I have proved to them that it is all meaningless." So this is nihilism, right? This is what nihilism is. It's the recognition that everything that you believe and everything that you value is a lie. But not only that, right? Because it's also a recognition that everything that your ancestors, right, your venerated ancestors worked for is all in vain, right? This long tradition that has made you, in some sense, that you emerged out of, it was all bullshit, right? That's nihilism. And This, for Tolstoy, was almost unbearable. Right? Um, for us, for many people in the modern world, it's just accepted as a kind of fact. But of course, that's just the settling in of nihilism, right? For Tolstoy, it was an acute realization. He goes on. It happened with me, as it happens with everyone who contracts a fatal internal disease. At first, there were the insignificant symptoms of an ailment, which the patient ignores. Then these symptoms recur more and more frequently until they merge into one continuous duration of suffering. The suffering increases, and before he can turn around, the patient discovers what he already knew. The thing he had taken for a mere indisposition is, in fact, the most important thing on earth to him, is, in fact, death. This is exactly what happened to me. I realized that this was not an incidental ailment, but something very serious, and that if the same questions should continue to recur, I would have to answer them. And I tried to answer them. The questions seemed to be such foolish, simple, childish questions. But as soon as I laid my hands on them and tried to resolve them, I was immediately convinced, first of all, that they were not childish and foolish questions, but the most vital and profound questions in life. And secondly, that no matter how much I pondered them, there was no way I could resolve them. Before I could be occupied with my samsara estate, with the education of my son, or with the writing of my books, I had to know why I was doing these things. As long as I do not know the reason why, I cannot do anything. In the middle of my concern with the household, which at the time kept me quite busy, a question would suddenly come into my head. Very well, you will have 6,000 Deciatins in the Samara province, as well as 300 horses. What then? And I was completely taken aback and did not know what else to think. As soon as I started to think about the education of my children, I would ask myself, why? Or I would reflect on how the people might attain prosperity, and I would suddenly ask myself, what concern is it of mine? Or in the middle of thinking about the fame that my works were bringing me, I would say to myself, very well, you will be more famous than Gogol, Pushkin, Shakespeare, Molière, more famous than all the writers in the world. So what? Well, that's what happens, right? When you lose your why. And, he was a successful person, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter to him because he had no why. He had no reason. As Nietzsche said in the Genealogy of Morals, it is not suffering, right? Nihilism, well, he said this in multiple, nihilism is not brought about by suffering. People will take all sorts of suffering, as long as they have a meaning for it, as long as there's a purpose to it. But as soon as you lose that meaning and purpose, right, then it's all suffering, right? The world just appears to be nothing but meaningless suffering at that point. Tolstoy goes on to say, and I could find absolutely no reply. My life came to a stop. I could breathe, eat, drink, and sleep. Indeed, I could not help but breathe, eat, drink, and sleep. But there was no life in me, because I had no desires whose satisfaction I would have found reasonable. If I wanted something, I knew beforehand that it did not matter whether or not I got it. If a fairy had come and offered to fulfill my every wish, I would not have known what to wish for. If in moments of intoxication I should have not desires but the habits of old desires, in moments of sobriety I knew that it was all a delusion, that I really desired nothing. I did not even want to discover truth anymore, because I had guessed what it was. The truth was that life is meaningless. It was as though I had lived a little, wandered a little, until I came to the precipice, and I clearly saw that there was nothing ahead except ruin, and there was no stopping, no turning back, no closing my eyes so I would not see that there was nothing ahead except the deception of life and of happiness and the reality of suffering and death, of complete annihilation. Stopping there for a minute. I mean, that's the abyss, right? When Nietzsche said, when you look long enough into the abyss looks also into you. Well, that's the abyss, right? That's the abyss of nihilism, right? As soon as the meaning is gone, right, all that you see is the terrible aspects of life, right? The fact that everything is going to die, and we all suffer along the way, and all this, right? That's all that's left without meaning. And it is what Tolstoy describes it as, right? It's the abyss. He goes on. I grew sick of life. Some irresistible force was leading me to somehow get rid of it. It was not that I wanted to kill myself. The force that was leading me away from life was more powerful, more absolute, more all-encompassing than any desire. With all my strength, I struggled to get away from life. The thought of suicide came to me as naturally then as the thought of improving life had come to me before. This thought was such a temptation that I had to use cunning against myself in order to not go through with it too hastily. I did not want to be in a hurry, only because I wanted to use all of my strength to untangle my thoughts. If I could not get them untangled, I told myself I could always go ahead with it. And there I was, a fortunate man, carrying a rope from my room where I was alone every night as I undressed, so that I would not hang myself from the beam between the closets. And I quit going hunting with a gun, so that I would not be too easily tempted to rid myself of life. I myself did not know what I wanted. I was afraid of life. I struggled to get rid of it, and yet I hoped for something from it. Albert Camus, he said that the only real philosophical question was whether or not we should commit suicide. As far as I'm concerned, there are other important questions besides that. But this is the way to. That's just nihilism, right? I mean, when you go into that pit, life appears so meaningless that it might as well not even exist, right? And that's what Tolstoy was experiencing here. He's experiencing, as best I can tell, the same thing that Camus experienced. He goes on. And this was happening to me at a time when, from all indications, I should have been considered a completely happy man. This was when I was not yet 50 years old. I had a good, loving, and beloved wife, fine children, and a large estate that was growing and expanding without any effort on my part. More than ever before, I was respected by friends and acquaintances, praised by strangers, and I could claim a certain renown without really deluding myself. Moreover, I was not physically and mentally unhealthy. On the contrary, I enjoyed a physical and mental vigor such as I had rarely encountered among others my age. Physically, I could keep up with the peasants working in the fields. Mentally, I could work 8 and 10 hours at a stretch without suffering any after effects from the strain. And in such a state of affairs, I came to a point where I could not live. And even though I feared death, I had to employ ruses against myself to keep from committing suicide. I described my spiritual condition to myself in this way. My life is some kind of stupid and evil practical joke that someone is playing on me, in spite of the fact that I did not acknowledge the existence of any someone who might have created me. The notion that someone brought me into the world as a stupid and evil joke seemed to be the most natural way to describe my condition. End quote. That's nihilism, right? Like, if you get rid of all of the meaning in life, you get rid of the purpose and the significance and the coherence of the world, all that you're left with is the terribleness of the world in some sense, and the fact that everything is going to pass away and everything is going to suffer along the way. And it does look like it's all just, and especially, because, as Tolstoy said, right, it was the fact that his ancestors and the people who he adopted his culture from, they were wrong, right? And they were working for nothing. At least that's what he thought. And so it all looks like a big joke, right? And it looks like everything that you're working for is just a big joke. It's a big lie, right? Well, that's nihilism, right? That's the meaning crisis. People don't experience it that acutely anymore because it's just the world that we grow up in, right? We grow up in that world of meaninglessness, but it's certainly not the natural state. So we're going to move on now to talk about what you might call the dark side of meaning, right? So we talk about meaning in life as this good thing, but there are ways to attain meaning in life that aren't necessarily what we would consider good. Most especially the adoption of pseudo-religious ideologies, generally speaking, political ideologies, pseudo-religious political ideologies, and out-group hatred. These things can confer meaning in life. And they do so because they constrain uncertainty and they integrate you. Like they adopting an ideology that allows you to hate a group of people, and especially if you're doing it in a group with other people, this can confer this can have a kind of integrated effect on you, and it can confer meaning in life, but it's pathological, I would suggest. I'm going to read what Peterson and Flanders wrote about this in their 2002 paper, and the motivation behind ideological rigidity, which confers a sense of meaning for a good reason. They say, and I quote, that anomalies, are unsettling because they represent everything that lies outside the domain of the understood world. In consequence, we have profound a priori motivation to avoid anomaly, to ignore complexity, and to maintain the structural integrity of our belief systems. Anything unexpected, that is, new phenomena, new ideas, new people, reintroduces the overwhelming complexity that our beliefs simplify. This introduced complexity, in turn, threatens the stability and security that our beliefs tentatively confer on existence. It is necessary for us to generate simplified, functional models in order to function in situations constantly beyond our understanding. However, this process of simplified functional modeling can be pathologized by individuals who are unwilling to allow any unconstrained complexity whatsoever to exist. Pathologized, that is, by the existential cowards who make ideological purity the hallmark of existence. The adapted human being is protected by a functional shell of belief, but he or she is also able to repair that shell or even to reconstruct it in its entirety when it is challenged by a shift in circumstance or environment. Ideologically committed individuals, by contrast, make personal omniscience in the guise of obeisance to a transpersonal belief system an axiom of individual faith. In consequence, they undermine, then destroy, their personal capacity to explore and update, since everything that needs to be known has, in their view, already been discovered. End quote. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is what is happening in large swaths of the university, right? There are certain questions about race, gender, sex, sexuality, and there are a number of people within the universities who believe that they already know the answers to these questions, and that anybody who explores the answers about sex differences in interest in certain careers, right? So things like that. That these are like bad people who need to be punished. Okay, that's ideological rigidity. And of course, what's going on in the universities is largely a left-wing phenomenon. But don't make any mistake that conservatives are immune to ideological rigidity. You would have to be historically ignorant to believe that. And of course, anybody who's ever tried to have a rational conversation with somebody who's like really into Trump will see the ideological rigidity of conservatives just as blatantly. But this is what it is. This attitude that the answers to the questions that are important have already been answered, finally, and that anybody who explores there is only making trouble, right? Like that's the attitude in some sense, and it does constrain uncertainty, and it does constrain anomalies, right? Because if you have certain beliefs that are really tied up with your sense of personal identity, your identity as a good person, then you can't allow people to disrupt those beliefs, because then they will disrupt that core part of your identity, that says, this is what makes me a good person. This is what we see from ideologues. They can't allow people to explore ideas that would disrupt their sense of being a good person, right? It's something like that. Meaning of life can also be conferred through the hatred of an outgroup. So especially when this occurs collectively, because it integrates you in multiple ways. It integrates you with other people, if there's collective hatred of an outgroup, but it also gives you a sense of purpose and a sense of coherence, because the world sort of, all that you can project all of the problems of the world onto a particular outgroup and then hate that outgroup. And that gives you, it makes the world make sense in some important sense. And so it provides a sense of meaning in life. There's a really nice paper written about this last year, Elnacori and colleagues, and so I'm going to read what they wrote about it. They said, and I quote, "What makes life feel meaningful? Answers to this question often reference the pursuit of noble ideals, fulfilling positive relationships, and a pro-social dedication to helping others. But are there alternative, darker routes to meaning in life? The present research investigated whether hatred of other people or collective entities might be one such darker route to meaning in life. While this hypothesis may be counterintuitive, there are reasons to believe that hate can provide all three established features of meaning in life: purpose, significance, and coherence. Hate might provide purpose by energizing people to challenge the hated group, such as in sports rivalries or more damning ethnic conflicts. Hate might also provide significance by convincing people that eliminating the hated object is of cosmic importance, a righteous cause worthy of virtuous violence. Finally, hate might provide people with a simplistic us versus them worldview that inspires coherence and quells uncertainty, especially for those who experience threat. Thus, by giving people an energizing purpose, a significant enemy, and a coherent worldview, hate might be a reliable way to spur meaning in life. From the conclusion of their study, they say this, and I quote, that the findings across studies 1 and 2 indicate that hate is related to meaning in life through elevated feelings of determination, eagerness, and enthusiasm, and through muted feelings of conflict, uncertainty, and confusion. Moreover, additional analyses found that this effect was primarily driven by collective but not personal forms of hate. Classic and contemporary theories in psychology and beyond propose that various threats can cause zealous responses linked to collective hate. The present research offers one reason behind the appeal of collective hate in such circumstances: its ability to spur meaning in life. End quote. And so the point here is just that we want to make clear that meaning in life can be conferred through things that are not pro-social, that are antisocial. And hatred of an outgroup is not really antisocial in the normal sense, right? So these are not sociopaths. And in fact, the people who really hate outgroups are very likely to think of themselves as being very good people, very good and moral people. They're going against the enemy, right? The bad guys. They're fighting the bad guys. And this is, we're going to talk more about this in part 9, but this is a huge problem in our own culture, as far as I'm concerned, because each side of the political aisle sees the other side as being, especially let's say the most extreme 15% of people on either side. It's something like that. I mean, they see the other side as being absolutely evil or insane. And of course, I think this is an unsustainable position for a culture to be in the long run. And we're seeing this, we'll talk about that in part 9, but it is a problem. The point here is just that, you can integrate yourself in ways that are not great, but they can still provide a sort of integration. So to recap what we've talked about here. So in this video, I have conceptualized meaning in life as a mood, and I'm using that term in the way that Marco del Giudice used it in his 2021 paper. So just to recap that, he said that mood mechanisms integrate over multiple inputs, and this creates some opportunities for regulation that are not available for lower order mechanisms. The important one is that it becomes possible to employ compensatory strategies. This is exactly what we see in the research on meaning in life, right? The meaning maintenance model and the research around the meaning maintenance model provides evidence for exactly these kinds of compensatory strategies with meaning making, right? So if your meaning is disrupted in one domain, you can compensate by bolstering the meaning in another totally unrelated domain. The 3 aspects of meaning in life that are found in the empirical literature indicate that meaning in life is a subjective state that is tracking the level of psychological integration, and I would argue it's doing so via some kind of internal regulatory variable, right? What the evolutionary psychologists call an internal regulatory variable. So we see that coherence, purpose, and significance, all of these are tracking different kinds of integration. Worldviews are especially important for meaning in life because our answers to the big questions, right, whether they're implicit or explicit, our answers to the big questions constrain everything else. They constrain our other goals and beliefs and perceptions. And that means that the disintegration of those answers is going to cause a massive increase in psychological entropy. That's what Tolstoy was experiencing. I read that long quote by Tolstoy. That's what that was: psychological entropy induced by the loss of his worldview. And that's the meaning crisis, essentially. We experienced it, many people experienced that personally, and then our culture experienced it collectively to some degree with, what Louis Sass described as the madness of modernism and postmodernism. But many intellectuals at that time, when this was happening, they experienced this psychological crisis in reaction to the death of God, and it makes perfect sense as an increase in psychological entropy induced by the loss of their worldview. So that is it for video 1 of part 7. In video 2, we are going to talk about meaning as it manifests in particular experiences. So here we talked about meaning in life as a kind of long-term mood that is tracking the extent to which you are an integrated creature psychologically, right? To the extent to which your values, your goals, your beliefs, and perceptions are functionally integrated together into a harmonious whole. When they are, you feel a sense of meaning in life. When they become disintegrated, you feel anxiety. And in the next video, we're going to talk about experiences that are felt as deeply meaningful. So these are things like the flow state, right? Being in the flow state when you're working on a project or playing a sport or something like that. This is something that people feel is deeply meaningful. And then what Abraham Maslow called peak experiences, which can be induced through psychedelics, the research on psychedelics like psilocybin. Psilocybin is reliably rated as one of the most meaningful experiences of people's lives, and we can understand why that's the case through looking at the cognitive science literature around that topic. So that's what we're going to look at in the next video, and we're going to put forward, why it is that we have this instinct of meaning. So thank you for your time and attention, and I hope to see you on the next video. Goodbye.